2021 webinars. And thanks for joining us today. To begin, I would like to acknowledge my gratitude for the chance to work, live, and learn on the territorial lands of the Ktunaxa, Sinixt, and Syilx people. And we invite you to share the lands that you live on and are participating from today in the chat section, if you would like. Thanks to the recovery cohort and others that are supporting the creation of these sessions, and the BC Association of Emergency Managers for supporting and hosting these meetings. Also, thank you to BC Hydro for some funding that we've received to help present this second series of webinars. This year, we have a similar format for the sessions, but we are lucky to have a new host. Peter Smith is the Executive Director for the Canadian Centre for Rural Creativity, and I believe we are in good hands with Peter, who has hosted various conferences and presentations over the years, and will keep these sessions moving along with skill and effervescence. So, one moment, please. And before we begin, I would first like to invite Deborah Jones-Middleton, the chair of the BC Association of Emergency Managers, to say a few words. Then Peter will take us forward from there.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very honored to be coming to you today from the traditional territory of the 14 First Nations that we all live, work, and play in the regional district of Bulkley-Nechako. The province of BC has been hit hard over the last few years between wildfires, flooding, and landslides, to name the more significant events causing evacuation of our residents. Many BC residents have been greatly impacted, many losing their homes or having significant damage to their homes. It has become extremely important for emergency personnel to understand and become very well educated in the recovery process. I am very grateful to Deb Borsos, and so is the BC Association of Emergency Managers, because she has made sure this webinar series is happening. I'll now turn it over to Peter Smith to lead us through the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deb. That's great. I will start by telling you that I am in the city of Toronto, and that I acknowledge I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and further acknowledge that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Elder and scientist Dr. Leroy Littlebear said not long ago, while we all may take a different path to get to the top of the mountain.
So now you want to talk to me the way you did, Mike. Now you want to cry your eyes out to me.
Just so maybe we could just mute our microphones. You're getting a little bit of interference there. Elder and scientist Dr. Leroy Littlebear said not long ago, while we all may take a different path to get to the top of the mountain, while some might get there quicker than others, by the time we get there, we all share the same vision. Let's embark on an honest path forward. Let us travel with respect as we work our way up the mountain to hopefully one day be able to share the same vision. It is great to be here. I attended the first round of webinars last year and was very glad that I did. I learned a lot. The work going on in community recovery is beyond awesome. I am glad we have folks like Deb and Chris, who will be speaking later, and folks like you who are out there on patrol, doing all you can do to assist the rest of us in rebuilding our communities after disaster strikes. When I agreed to be the moderator for this series, I mentioned to Deb and Chris that BC, sadly, in the last 2 years, has become a bellwether for the rest of the world, for what could be in store for the rest of us as we deal with climate change. And the hits just keep on coming. As Deborah mentioned, BC has become a lab for what can be done after disaster strikes, though. Where you've weathered infestation of spruce beetles, fires that have razed towns, taken lives, floods that have filled valleys, covered farms, consumed towns. There have been landslides and collapsed infrastructure, and heat domes and snow events. And man, it just goes on. The lessons you've learned, the evolving methodologies you've developed, come from real-time, real-world experience, and that knowledge needs to be shared. I encourage you all to take the recordings of these webinars and share them with your networks. As my father used to say, experience is a hard teacher, but it is a necessary one. and British Columbia has more than its fair share of experiences of late. I believe these webinars are tools for recovery as we move further into this century. Now, I admit that my knowledge of the work going on in recovery is limited, but as we go through the next 6 sessions, I know it will grow. The aim of the webinars, as Deb and Chris explained to me, is to build community of those in the field of recovery, to share best practices, and to network with those involved in the project of recovery, which needs to be all of us. For me, it's also an opportunity to have a little oos. Now, that would be an out of silo experience. Now, it can be a little disorienting at first, but keep at it. You will come around, and when you do, there will be another understanding awaiting. Courtesy of science, perhaps art, maybe local knowledge. The more oos we have, the more we realize the merit of connecting with others outside our specific fields of endeavor. As someone once said to me, just because it's not being done the way you would do it doesn't mean it's not getting done. I read in the paper a couple of weeks ago about the UBC engineers and climate scientists and how they're coming together now, but that wasn't always the case. I think there's an opportunity for us now to learn another language, or take the language that we do know and figure out a way to be able to translate that to others in order for us to go forward. This is not one person's job. We are the they that we've been waiting for. I want to thank who is running the controls for today's webinar and for all the webinars, and you should be thankful of that. And it's not me, because God knows where we'd end up if you had me pushing the buttons. Now, the batting order for the webinars after today include donations management, food security, debris management, community foundations and funding, relocation, and climate change. And I know they're all going to be awesome. Any resources or information or comments you have, you can share in the chat section, the little button at the bottom of your screen there. There will be a list made and shared of links as well as presenters' contact info at the end of the series. Now, if you want to contact a presenter to find information shared from a particular session before then, please be in touch via the following link. So I'm not sure if someone can pop in the communitydisasterrecovery@gmail.com, but that's what it is. Maybe I'll post that a little bit later. The sessions are being recorded, as you've noted, and will be kept on the BC Association of Emergency website. It usually takes a week or so to get them loaded to the site, so please be patient with us. During the presentations, please leave your video and audio turned off. As for some attending, it can offer challenges and instability of connection. Our presenters will each speak for about 20 minutes or so, which should leave us about 15 minutes for your questions at the end. And before I introduce our first presenter today, I'll offer a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte, someone who knew a thing or three about disaster. Courage isn't having the strength to go on. It's going on when you don't have the strength. Since 2004, Deb Borsos has been involved in emergency management as a volunteer dispatcher, coordinator, and emergency support services volunteer and director. She completed her emergency management certification in 2014, as well as her exercise design certification from the Justice Institute of BC in 2021. Before and after falling into the abyss, as she calls it, of the emergency management sector, she spent 30 years working in healthcare as a phlebotomist and as a unit clerk in emergency rooms and other wards in hospitals across BC. For the last 10 years, Deb has focused on working in and studying community recovery in BC, Canada, and beyond. She is also a visual artist and has previously worked in the arts and nonprofit world as well. Today, Deb will be sharing experiences from her perspective of working in a variety of recovery positions in and around BC. She currently works as a recovery operations specialist for Emergency Management BC, but is not wearing that hat for the presentation today. So I will now turn it over to the illustrious Deb Borsos.
Thanks, Peter, except I believe we are starting with Chris.
Well,
I'm sorry about that.
Okay. My apologies. Okay, Chris. Okay. I've got to introduce Chris. This is haywire. So anyway, this is the first one. It will never be like this again. Famous last words. All right. It gives me great pleasure to not introduce Deb Borsos, but in fact, Chris Marsh. Now, Chris is the principal and lead consultant for Clear Sky Consulting Limited. It's an emergency management professional for over 25 years of public service and public safety experience. Chris created Clear Sky Consulting in July of 2020 with the intent of supporting rural communities across Western Canada with their emergency management planning. Prior to starting his own business, Chris was the manager of emergency programs for the regional district of Kootenay Boundary. Over a 3-year span, Chris led the regional district through several emergency events, including wildfires, hazardous material spills, landslides, severe weather events, and multiple flooding emergencies, including the catastrophic flooding of the Kettle River system in southern BC in 2018. Following the flood response, Chris was a flood recovery manager with Boundary Flood Recovery for 2 years. He was also a volunteer with Emergency Management BC for almost 10 years and holds a certificate in emergency management from the Justice Institute of BC and a diploma in environmental science from NAIT, the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. He is a captain with the Kootenay Boundary Regional Fire Rescue Service, and he and his family live in the West Kootenays and enjoy all the outdoor pursuits that the area offers. Chris, you can take it away. Deb, you don't get another introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for the warm introduction, and a huge thank you to the BC Association of Emergency Managers, of course, for sponsoring this event, and to Deb Borsos, who is the creator of all of these sessions, and who I've been super lucky to work with and learn a lot from. So thank you to those folks. I'll just share my screen here, and if somebody wants to give me a thumbs up that they can see that, that'd be great. Everybody can see the presentation?
Yep.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The impetus for this presentation really came from some discussions that Deb and I had a few months ago. And for those of us who weren't necessarily directly affected by the events of the wildfire season, or from the flooding that we had here in British Columbia in the fall, we were talking about how we can support people. And how we were noticing that, for a lot of communities, it was the first time they had been through a recovery event, having to make that transition from a typical response model to recovery. So we talked about what we might be able to provide, and these were some of the thoughts that we had, and just based on our experience, some of the support we thought would be helpful. So Peter's told you a little bit about myself. I've been involved in public safety for 25 plus years. And as Peter said, I was the manager of the emergency programs for the RDKB. I'm speaking with everybody today from the converging traditional and unceded territories of the Silks, Ktunaxa, and Sinixt First Nations. Grateful to be able to live and work here in this wonderful place. So a little bit about our flood in 2018 in the Boundary region of British Columbia. At the time, it was between a 1 in 200, 1 in 300 year flood. We've all sort of, I think, especially in British Columbia, we've come to understand that those numbers 1 in 200, 1 in 300 aren't as relevant as they used to be. We're certainly seeing, more impactful and more frequent events happening, especially flooding and wildfires. So, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude of that event. And this picture is from about May 9th in 2018 of the downtown core of Grand Forks. At the time, we said this was the most impactful flood since 1948. Of course, that's been all eclipsed by the events of the last few months across British Columbia. We evacuated about 3,000 people. We had about 450 structures damaged, most of those homes and businesses. And at the time, it was one of the largest recovery operations in BC history. We had a significant team that dealt with the recovery from this flood. I've had the opportunity over the last few months to support a few other organizations with flood recovery and wildfire recovery as well, assisting the Regional District of Central Okanagan with recovery from the White Rock Lake Fire, assisting the City of Abbotsford with their Sumas Prairie flood, and assisting the City of Merritt with flooding from the Coldwater River as well. So we think about community-led recovery, and recovery is one of these 4 pillars that we have in emergency management, and it's one of our least planned for or least thought about situations, because we don't really need it until we need it. We have a fairly concise definition from Emergency Management BC from their interim disaster framework documents. And it's the phase of emergency management in which steps and processes are taken and implemented to repair communities and to essentially bring things back to normal where we can. We think about recovery, and this is just a little refresher for everybody so we can all get in the same frame of mind. Infrastructure recovery, so there's basically 4 different pillars in community-led recovery, sometimes 5, sometimes housing gets broken out on its own. Because of the severity and the very specific needs involved with housing. But we have infrastructure where we think about things like roads and bridges and utilities and how do we get those systems back online for people. We have economic recovery where we think about our business communities and how we might be able to support them. They're clearly an economic driver for our communities and they need our support, especially during recovery from disasters. We have the recovery of people and communities, and this is really about mental and physical health, housing, and restoring that sense of community. And we also have environmental recovery. And so situations like fires and floods lead to environmental degradation. We have contamination issues, debris issues. All of those things need to be dealt with to restore that natural order. One of the questions that I've had in the past and we thought would be interesting to talk about today would be, when do you initiate recovery operations? And it's difficult to know exactly when to start. We often hear in guidance around incident command systems and the training that we take to work in emergency operations centers that recovery starts as soon as response starts. And while that's true, there's some very specific situations or very specific tasks that recovery needs to start with. Really, it's any response is this sort of balance between response and recovery, and figuring out when the recovery portion really needs to initiate. I kind of call it the 3 bears principle, right? So our friend Goldilocks and her bear friends, if we think about, not too hard, not too soft, not too hot, not too cold, recovery really needs to start, not too early or not too late in the response. We also need it to be not too intense in the beginning and be really receptive of what the community needs. Both of these pillars in emergency management can operate simultaneously. You can have response activities underway at the same time that you have recovery activities underway. But the response definitely feeds into what the recovery will need. And ideally, we don't necessarily want to have the same people involved in both. Often the people involved in response have very specific skill sets around response, and the people involved in recovery have different skill sets. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we've also, in an emergency operations center and emergency response, we put people in usually a pretty traumatic situation if it's been a major event. And we want to make sure that they're prepared for what comes beyond the response phase for them. And it's not always a great idea to have them just transition from response to recovery. So if it's this blend and we're trying to do this transition, how do we know that we've come to the end of response and we're moving into the recovery phase? There's a couple clues or a couple highlights that we can look at that can help us determine this. So maybe the emergency operations center and the incident commander are starting to wind down. Hopefully our evacuations are in the process of being lifted and we have the re-entry process underway. Maybe we have resources redeployed, and we see this often in wildfire situations where once that sort of major danger from the wildfire is sort of starting to become less, we see those resources deployed, and that's because the risk is lessened as well. We also see that with emergency operations centers where people are transitioning out of their roles, going back to their base roles, or moving on to other tasks. If we've got those life safety conditions met, right, lives are no longer at risk. That's a key piece, right, because otherwise that's still a response. We've got emergency support services established, and maybe we're thinking about transitioning out of that ESS mindset into longer term care for people. And a really good indicator is we start to get questions from the public. People are asking, I'm starting to get back into my house, I'm starting to undertake my recovery. How do I do that? Where do I find resources? What do I do next? That's a pretty clear indicator that it's time. There's a few things that we want to note about initiating recovery. And some of these things are obvious and some of them are less so. We should always try not to assume response tasks in the recovery groups. It's hard to do because we want to be helpful, and that's just the nature of who we are. But we do need to try to keep those two things separated and let the response do what it needs to do. It's important that the community is ready to start the recovery process, and sometimes we do see the recovery start a little bit early. People are still dealing with their reentry, getting back into their homes, getting their lives in order, and they're not quite ready for that recovery discussion. So it's important to sort of note when that might be, when it might be appropriate. And we can gauge that based on inquiries, to the recovery team and requests to local government and different indicators like that. And I just wanted to mention that we want to be careful about, preparedness and mitigation activities. So if we think about those 4 different pillars in emergency management, preparedness and mitigation, while all of these are definitely blended, recovery is really about resolving issues and getting people sort of back to normal, or if we're thinking about the Build Back Better principles, restoring our communities to better condition. But we don't necessarily want to loop preparedness and mitigation activities into the recovery. There are, programs, emergency management programs in local government that are directly related to those. Although I understand that it's super tricky sometimes to not want to make changes when we're on the heels of a fairly major disaster and we want to, implement some improvements in our communities. So I think probably many of the people on this call have seen this this line sort of chart, and on the left-hand side we have kind of a range of emotion from low to high, and across the bottom we have time. The preparedness mitigation phases are in that sort of pre-disaster phase. That's where we're anticipating, we're getting ready for something, hopefully. We have the impact, that event happens. That climb to the peak at the honeymoon is really, that's really around the response side of things. And then we have that unfortunate drop and down to where we get into emotional lows and we start building back from that. That's really the recovery phase in a nutshell, kind of concluding when we get things back to normal or better than they used to be. But it's a challenge. Recovery by nature is working with individuals when they're at their lowest, and that is a challenging thing. And people who undertake recovery tasks, my hat's off to them, because that's a difficult role to play for sure. When we think about different phases within recovery, it's easy to break them into different objectives, sort of related to short, medium, and long-term objectives. My apologies for the typing, or the font here is quite small, but in our short term, that's really, like I said, that transition from response to recovery. So establishing staffing, establishing what the recovery is going to look like, scoping that a little bit, providing emergency shelter for people. It's the reception center, and the reception center transitioning to a resiliency center, making sure that there's lots of public information. We have to obviously deal with initial debris restoration, critical infrastructure restoration, getting the power back on, getting the water safe, getting the roads open, getting people back into their homes after evacuations. And making sure that things like disaster psychosocial support are initiated, because an event like a fire or flood or anything like that is very traumatic on individuals, and we want to make sure they have the support they need. Just talking a little bit more about recovery during response. So if we are undertaking that, recovery starts when response starts, there's a few things that the recovery team or the recovery manager or just the recovery branch in the emergency operations center can be working on. And that initial data gathering, measuring those impacts, that's incredibly critical in understanding what's going to be required for our further recovery. And what that feeds into is what we call a post-disaster needs assessment. So really figuring out, how many houses were affected, how many people can go home, who's going to need long-term housing, how many businesses were affected, how many employees does that affect, measuring our critical infrastructure impacts. All of that feeds into that PDNA. Where do you find the data for that? There's lots of different places that we can gather that data. Thinking about different organizations like the Canadian Red Cross and emergency support services provide amazing support, and they generate a ton of information about the event itself. Clearly working with a lot of different partners like utilities, local governments, provincial ministries, all these different organizations are going to have an idea of the impact. And talking with our local nonprofits as well, they'll immediately start seeing an uptick in the support services that they provide, and they're an important spot for gathering that data as well. When we are still undertaking response activities, applying a recovery lens can be really helpful. So if we're thinking about, if the response is really focused on a couple weeks where we're mitigating life safety and we're worrying about property and things like that, if we think about recovery as this long-term goal where we want to, get people back to normal, build back better, having that recovery lens can change some of the way the decisions are made or some of the activities that are undertaken in response, just so that we're thinking with some of those longer-term goals in mind. We want to form the basis for a recovery plan. A recovery plan is an important part of sort of scoping your recovery, identifying resources, identifying the impacts, and making sure that we're expressing that to our partners. For example, if we're a recovery team in a local community, making sure that local government, our partners at Emergency Management BC and elsewhere are knowing that we're thinking about and or what we're thinking about as far as recovery. And so, starting to build that plan is an important piece. Considering recovery team needs. So what do we think we're going to need for staff? Where are those staff going to work? What sort of technology are they going to need? Do they need computers, cell phones, those sorts of things? Making those relationships with the people that we think we're going to need support from in recovery. So local nonprofits, provincial ministries, folks like the Community Recovery Branch at Emergency Management BC, all going to be very important to us. And how we're going to fund recovery is very important as well. And I think Deb's going to touch on this a little bit more, but there's a number of different ways that we can seek funding to support recovery activities. And really making those connections with recovery organizations. So we have large disaster response organizations here in Canada who are incredibly helpful, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. But we also have local organizations, nonprofits and support organizations who play an incredible role in recovery. And we certainly, when we're in response, we want to be reaching out to those groups, making sure that they know what we're experiencing, what the population's experiencing, and what we might need for support from them. And they're different than support organizations, our first responder organizations, police, fire, ambulance, search and rescue, utilities, those sorts of organizations. The people we need help from in recovery are really those community support organizations, mental health advocates, housing advocates, people that support seniors or vulnerable populations. Those individuals and those groups are going to be incredibly important during the recovery phase. And we want to make sure that we're reaching out, getting those discussions started, even when we're still in response. Some of the early recovery activities, and a nice picture here from the City of Merritt when they transitioned their reception center into a resiliency center. The resiliency center is really, it's a slight adjustment from the reception center. So reception centers are where we go to get emergency support services and be connected with various organizations that can support us during, the event itself. A resiliency center is really where we start going to get information about rebuilding our homes, accessing emergency funding supports like the Disaster Financial Assistance Program. Where do we go to get initial insurance information? How do we make an insurance claim? If my doctor's office is closed, how do I deal with that? And so that resiliency center becomes a key community hub and just a place where people can meet and gather and get information and start remaking those connections in the community. Like I said, we'll have to work on that post-disaster needs assessment. We really want to have a really clear understanding of what those needs are. We're seeking funding for and hiring a recovery manager, and that recovery manager or recovery coordinator or whatever their title is, their job will be to start scoping their recovery team and thinking about what they need to be effective to move that forward. We want to identify immediate needs, right? Housing is a very critical one. Debris management starts even before the response ends. So there's a couple things that we have to be really quick off the mark with, or we sort of get left behind as recovery and the community will deal with it themselves. And it's not always, in the best fashion for anybody. So we want to be quick on those things. And one of the things that myself and a few other consultants have been trying to develop a little bit and build a little bit more awareness around is this concept of starting some of our early recovery planning through a management by objectives process. And so what we've done for a few different communities is we've come in, we've spent a day with elected officials, local government leaders, emergency management people, and other interested parties. And we've talked about, what is the recovery process going to look like for a certain community? We do a little bit of a scoping exercise. We try to really dig down into what the desires of both the community and the local government are. And there's, as Deb may say in her presentation, there's a million different ways to undertake recovery, and each of them is, it's different. It's kind of like a fingerprint, and it's very specific to the situation and the community that you're working with. And we want to, figure out what those early needs are and make sure that we're starting to work on those and come up with an interim recovery plan so that even if there's not a recovery manager in place, even if we're not that far along, whoever gets sort of tasked with that role has somewhere to start, right? They have somewhere that they can start filling in that plan and start working on some of those initial things. The onset of recovery is quite incapacitating. It's huge, right? It's everything's on the table all at once, and it all needs to be done today. And so having that interim plan helps narrow down some of those needs. And all of this is intended just to reduce the overall length of recovery. Anywhere that we can shortcut the recovery process, both for the affected individuals and for local governments or recovery teams, just makes the recovery so much easier. And I'm sure everybody has an example or they've heard something about where the recovery didn't go well. It was delayed. There was issues in getting things in place, and that just it just draws out the recovery of our communities, and it's just harder on the individuals affected by emergency events. So anywhere we can shorten that, it immediately makes it better for everybody involved, including the recovery team. We have an incredible amount of resources available during recovery, and so that's where, if we're talking about starting recovery during the response phase, that we can be reaching out to organizations and making sure that they're on notice or aware of our event, and that they're making plans to help us with that. Some of our key partners, obviously, in planning a recovery are the Emergency Management BC Community Recovery Branch. Just a fantastic group of individuals who do a lot of really incredible work. We have like I mentioned several times, community groups will play a huge role. And so, environmental groups, community support groups, food banks, people who are supporting individuals during peacetime, if you'll call it that, also play a huge role in recovery, because we see all of those needs exacerbated, and those groups are going to work with those individuals no matter what, and we certainly want them on the recovery team. And like I mentioned, large national community support organizations, and there's just a few of them listed here. The Canadian Red Cross is a huge partner for many of our disasters. Team Rubicon, Samaritan's Purse, Mennonite Disaster Services, you name it. The key with some of these organizations is making sure that they're aware of your event and what your potential needs are early on, because then they'll be able to dedicate resources to assist you. When we see things like we saw in British Columbia this fall, where we had flooding in a wide variety of different locations, they're stretched thin just like everybody else is, right? So giving them more information early on helps them plan how they'll be able to support. And I'll give you an example. Following our flooding in 2018 in the Boundary region, we had, like I said, 450 different structures that were damaged by flooding. Samaritan's Purse came in early. We had a great connection within the community and the faith community in Grand Forks who helped us make that connection. Samaritan's Purse came in and cleaned out over 200 homes that were affected by flooding, and that was stripping them right down to the studs, removing flooring and house contents, insulation, drywall, you name it, and making those homes safe for people to go back into. So an incredible resource that we would not have been able to do at the local government level. So making sure that we have relationships built with those organizations and that they're aware of our issues, very, very critical. And I'm going to turn it over to Deb now to talk about some of the more medium and long-term issues as well. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time. And if anybody would like to contact me, I'm happy to talk with anybody about any of this. My email's here, and you're more than welcome to contact me. Back to you, Peter.
Yes, thanks so much, Chris. There was a ton in there, and no, really, and inspiring as well. The management by objective seems like just a very shareable idea. I think failure to prepare is to prepare for failure, as the coach says of his team. But forewarned is forearmed. A bunch of things came into my head. I just have one question before we move over to Deb. If you looking ahead into the future, the next few years, because honestly, BC has become this lab for disaster, sadly. But what are you seeing going forward with regards to the work that you do? And do you have a wish list? Is there one thing you'd like to see, just off the top of your head, for, well, rather than not having any more events, but is there something that's on your wish list?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part answer. I've had an opportunity to work with a few organizations over the past year, and it's been really inspiring to see this recognition of needing additional resources to manage the events that we're seeing. So getting out of this mindset that we have to prepare for something bad to happen someday. And a lot of organizations are now starting to look at it and saying, look, we're going to have responses possibly every year. Maybe it's a fire, maybe it's a flood, maybe it's both. They don't necessarily fall within the normal sort of time frames that we're used to. You know, fall flooding in BC is abnormal, right? So seeing organizations think about that, and then resourcing appropriately, maybe hiring new staff, really working on their planning, really working on recovery plans ahead of time so that they have resources in the community identified, they've got their relationships in place. Yeah, so that's my wish list. Is one half of it is making sure that organizations like local government emergency management groups are prepared. And then the second part of that is I've been working with an organization here in the southeast part of British Columbia to build a fire department and EOC Emergency Operations Center wellness program to take care of their staff. Not just when we have activations for emergencies, but just the kind of the ongoing stress in this industry right now of knowing that something's going to happen and it's going to be challenging when it does happen. Making sure that we've got the systems in place to ensure the sustainability of emergency management personnel, I think, is really important. So that proper resourcing and making sure that we're taking care of our people, that's I think we need a lot of development in that area, and really encouraged to see that conversation coming to the forefront as we move forward.
Oh, that's awesome. There is a question I'm going to ask you to think about. I'm going to turn it over to Deb right now, and it comes in the chat. It says, excellent presentation, Chris. I agree, very informative. With your experience and awareness of resiliency centers, are they used by the general public, percentage of community? Does it truly become a hub as we all want it to be? So if you can just think on that. I'm now going to reintroduce Deb. I'm not going to give her the big, long introduction that I already gave, which I gave to Chris, but I will say, there's a poet named Lorna Crozier, and one of the lines in her poem is, there's always something to figure out. And for me, Deb Borsos is somebody who can figure a lot out. I will turn it over to you, Deb, and we'll see you in a bit. Keep adding your questions to the chat too, folks.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to attempt some technology and share my screen, and we'll see if it works. Fingers crossed. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes? Okay, cool. All right, one moment, please. Whoops. Uh-oh. Okay. Hold on. I'm a technologically challenged person as well, Peter. We do well together.
We are
Okay.
a disaster, Deb.
My part of the presentation will speak to both considerations of timing in relation to different aspects of recovery, the pace and how it varies, and the medium and longer term points, including when recovery winds down and the community carries on with their new normals. Several years ago, a colleague of mine observed that community recovery starts in a fog and ends in a mist, which sums it up pretty well. So it makes it difficult at times to identify when recovery starts and ends. Recovery takes much longer than response to get through. Case in point, at the longer end of recovery, during the first job I did in recovery, I was engaged with supporting a community for about 2 years, and some of their projects carried on well past that, and their water system took 7 years to rebuild. But happily, they finally got it back in place. Come on, here we go. Okay. Some of the topics that I'm going to be discussing: communications, who's sharing information, what type, ongoing communications, etc. Grant writing and other funding, what to be aware of, funding in later stages, who comes to the table and when to reach out for recovery support, who to invite, etc. Donations management, depending on the size of the event, how long to keep it running, and what about new events and overlaps, etc. Timing and timelines, putting your recovery needs and projects into a visual timeline sometimes helps, and exit strategies and recovery planning, and when does it wind up and what does that involve when recovery stops. It doesn't always just stop. Okay, come on, there we go. Communications. Once the immediate recovery efforts have begun and initial communications within and outside the community are launched, finding longer-term means of communicating that works need to be identified. It might take several tries to be as effective as possible, and it will probably mean different types of communications with different paces as the recovery progresses. If a good line of communication was established during the time residents are evacuated, so knowing where your residents have gone to and how to remain in touch, it'll pay off through the medium to long term. The longer the community remains evacuated, the greater the chance they may want to or need to go elsewhere, and maintaining contact with them does keep them connected to home no matter where they are. In one event I was in, I made an email list of all the renters and landowners right at the start and to keep them informed. This worked. It was a smallish community, but they were in fact spread across the world. And I used that method consistently the whole time I was in that role, which was for about 2 years, just to give them all the updates and keep them sharing that same information from their own community. Ideas: if you have a communications person to keep a page on your government website updated, it will help in sharing accurate information that is current and consistently shared out. Letting the community know what kind of timing to expect in terms of new information being shared will help staff as well as residents in recovery as well as in response. Something like, we'll be posting core updates every other day as well as time-sensitive information more frequently. We'll keep them coming back to the one site and keep it consistent. In the longer term, information and resources can continue to engage people, as in many cases, they'll still be seeking supports for longer term projects. As well, the greater community will also appreciate being kept updated as to how the affected community is doing. Oftentimes, the greater community is forgotten, and many of them, in fact, are the donors and supporters of the affected community. Another point: by the time longer term efforts and projects are initiated, an entire year and funding cycle by local funders may have passed, but new funding and resource opportunities should continue to be posted and shared as they come up. Other types of social media, such as the Evil Facebook, a community Facebook page launched around the event, which usually happens like within about 9 seconds of an event. And the recovery process is a place for affected residents to come together online, particularly if they're evacuated for an extended period and won't be likely to be seeing their friends and neighbors in person. That's one place they can go to and connect. Hopefully there will be a consistent admin person to start it up and monitor it, as it can be a valuable portal to tell stories, self-source resources, and share the small and big wins. The frequency of posts will most likely lessen as recovery lengthens, and that isn't a bad thing. It shows that things are progressing and people are getting on with their recovery processes. Okay, try giving you another slide. Grants and funding and timing. Of late, there's been more and more understanding of the need for a different method for funding recovery as well as for other general grant programs. Community foundations are excellent institutions to embrace the idea of focused recovery funding. Their mandates usually involve raising funds to address identified needs across a variety of sectors. And this isn't at all to say that the long list of other support agencies are not just as valuable. This is just an example of one type of funder that can respond and recently have begun considering how better to serve communities with requests for recovery projects specifically. With recent events in the past several years that have affected communities and left more need for funding focused on recovery projects, there has begun a general conversation about how funding can be more directed with better timelines and a more user-friendly application and reporting process. Such as the amount of time a community, having a 6-month window that nicely ties into year-end financials within a funding organization won't be as helpful as leaving the application process open-ended, or at least having a lengthy amount of time to apply within, such as 1 or 2 years. It may take a while for identifying needs and then prioritizing these needs within the community. For instance, fixing the water system may be more important than rebuilding the local park. Community projects usually begin once the essential immediate needs have been met, and you need to factor in that any nonprofit group who may want to carry out some of these projects may also have been affected in some way. This could delay the capacity to apply for funding if it is a community-run event. One more thing to consider in timing when grant deadlines occur and then when the final reporting is needed, will it be the recovery manager doing the final reporting, or is this something that the staff will be doing further down the road? Occasionally there is no final reporting, but that's usually the exception, not the rule. Factoring in not only the time this takes, but the timing of when it may be needed is another aspect in the longer term. Example, one community I worked with included helping them find resources and writing grant applications, but they had quite a large project that had a number of funders attached to it. It took longer to complete than thought, and so I wasn't there to finish the final reporting for them, which was quite a monster to do. And one of the community members took it on, brave soul, and she did a great job, but they didn't have extra recovery staff by the time the final reporting came along. Disaster financial assistance funding and reporting is another consideration that may be entwined in recovery activities, usually in the medium to long or much longer timeline. There is a link that we can add to the DFA site, which has been updated and has actually really good information about it, about how to walk you through the process. A note on that, getting in early with a DFA application will help move things along. This is something to be aware of. If the community is overwhelmed and won't apply until day 89 of the 90-day window in which they accept applications, that's already 3 months into the recovery, and that's after DFA has been declared, though that part is usually done quite quickly after the event. In terms of capacity, priorities, and timing, being culturally aware is also needed. Being aware of particular cultural needs and practices will help to better understand the timing of recovery when supporting, for instance, Indigenous communities. Recovery could easily be going on when hunting season arrives, and gathering traditional foods for a community may easily be a priority, so other things relevant to recovery may be put aside. There are various things to consider in the pace and timing of things. If you are a funder listening to this, I hope it helps to better understand the need for malleability, for intake and length of time allowed for projects, and to remember that recovery needs to move at the pace of the community. Okay, we'll try another slide. Go. Who comes to the table and when? So when to reach out for extra support can be obvious or a little murky depending on the event. Initially, the community may feel they are prepared to deal with recovery themselves. Doing the post-disaster needs assessment, as Chris pointed out, will help with understanding short, medium, and long-term needs. It should also help to inform the decision as to whether or not you need a recovery manager, and this might be recognized right away or might not come to light until weeks later, as the bigger picture of damages is identified. Currently, the pool of experienced community recovery managers is growing, thankfully, due to the, unthankfully, due to the events of the last year, but you should factor in the time it takes to find a suitable person, as that may be longer than expected. Considering how long to hire someone for these days, a recovery manager can be hired initially for 3 to 6 months in order to create a draft recovery plan. And this plan, along with reflecting the longer term needs and projects the community will have to deal with, is also an indicator to share with the government and other agencies to help in justifying funding amounts and requests to complete projects. It can also help justify the need to extend recovery staff if it's realized that, oh, we still need help for a while. Backfilling the position of one of your emergency management staff might be another option, can leave you with more capacity in future in terms of recovery coordination. Again, this may take more time than expected to fill a position such as that. Coordination calls ongoing through the medium to long-term efforts can save gads of time for everyone. Instead of having to arrange individual calls regularly with each stakeholder and support agency that you need, note on that the EMBC regional office that you work with, which could quite possibly be stood up as a PREOC or a provincial regional emergency operations center, can help set up and host these calls and invite whomever the community would like at the table, and can continue hosting them, and it just saves all sorts of time for everybody. Okay. Donations management. What donations management looks like and how long you may need it for will depend on the size of the event and when and how big any other recent past events have been. Donations management can be carried out by a local group in a church basement. It can be coordinated by the province or the regional government. It can involve an NGO with huge warehouse space. It might be broken into different parts. It'll depend on the event and the capacity of the community to manage it or not. Some points on timing around donations. Awareness of events being held in the area. One event I was a manager for, there was a huge effort put into 2 events in the same area with many of the same audience, AKA donors, likely to attend. And the events were held on the same day at the same time. So it split the audience and neither of them did as well as expected because of it. Remember your 15 minutes of fame theory. It's really true. There are unfortunately so many other events happening. The focus on your event may be brief in terms of getting resources and donations. And there is also value in waiting, taking the time to build a fundraising campaign that fits the event and the needs further along. If the local authority are the ones putting it on, or in conjunction with a local group, human nature being what it is, people want to help right away, right out of the gate. But you could say something, you could give a public message that says something like, we're grateful for the generosity. If some would like to wait a bit, no doubt financial and other donations will also be useful in the longer term, something like that. I'm going to skip a few things because I see what time it is now. Okay. Come on. Sorry. Timing and timelines. I'll go through this very quickly. If you want to make a visual timeline for all the included projects in your recovery plan, sometimes it helps to just as a reminder to go, oh yeah, those things are coming up and that and that and that. You can do it on a whiteboard, a computer, a piece of paper on the wall, but looking at the PDNA and the draft recovery plan and potential tasks and projects to be done and putting them in a visual timeline can help as a reference. This is completely unscientific and is reference only. This is one that I built to show all the, not all of them, this is just a few of the things that you can look at in terms of projects or ongoing things in the timeline. Interim housing and long-term housing and infrastructure repair and transportation and food security and mental health needs. Cultural events that might come along at the same time. Sometimes you can hit a perfect storm like that first red star in the middle there. Everything's lined up. You have to be ready for that, dealing with all those things at the same time. Some of them you won't know what's coming along. You won't know what will trigger people with their emotional needs. Sometimes the 1-year event will be a big trigger for people in mental health needs. So that's just one example. I would like to spend more time on it, but we don't have it. So now we go on to exit strategies. One moment. Right. By the time the written plan is ready to show to the council or board, some things that are included may already be complete or close to it, having happened at the front end or when recovery begins its initial stages. They should also be included in the recovery plan as the best whole picture of the event for future use. It shows progress, which will always be an encouragement to those managing it that you've completed things, and it remains part of the entire process as a historic point. It can also help to inform future events. And I'll give you an example quickly of what that might look like. There's an exit strategy for a playground that was damaged in an event. And so you put in the resources and history, tell a bit about where the resources are coming from and who's giving and who's working together. The exit strategy shows what the recovery manager will do until what point, and then who's going to take that on after that point. Is it going to be the local government? Is it going to be a combination? You know, how is that going to work? But you don't want to just slam the door and walk out when you're done your contract. It has to be a gradual understanding and takeover by the local authority. Okay, I'm just going to skip to the next one, much as it kills me. Okay, so how do recovery ends? Mostly it doesn't just shut like crap. Remember the first consequence. Many people worked and something's legal. For some, it may never end as due to a number of factors. You may continue with it emotionally and in terms of things like billing, or sometimes recovery slows or ends when a new event happens. And it affects the community, and it has to be dealt with, and it puts recovery aside from the previous event. One gauge that is used as factual or financial end to recovery is when many or most of the projects identified in the recovery plan reach completion and are paid for, and the community has begun moving on as a whole. This is still difficult to identify, but easier than some other methods. And so this is an abbreviated version of just some of the different aspects to consider in timing with recovery. And any questions I am happy to answer, or back to you, Peter, for the last 35.2 seconds.
Yes, Deb, wow. I mean, we could have had an hour just on each of you. That was awesome. And there's a lot of great things going on in the chat. We have a couple of minutes. So perhaps I'll just go back and I'll bring up a couple of questions and we'll get through as much as we can, because there's some great observations. I learned from Alexa that we will be able to save the chat. So that will be part of what's available to everybody who's listening. And I certainly recommend there are links in there. There is a conversation going on. Chris has weighed in on a few things. Chris, I'll just go back to that question that I asked you to consider before we switched over to Deb. So with your experience and awareness of resiliency centers, are they used by the general public? Does it truly become a hub as we all want it to be?
Yeah, definitely in the early days, having that resiliency center is incredibly important. People want a place that they can go and talk to a human being and get answers to their questions about insurance and rebuilding and debris and everything else. There is a point in time where it becomes both the resiliency center gets used less, and I guess just keeping it staffed with subject matter experts gets harder and harder. So what you can do at that point is have a 1-800 number, an email address, or a physical location that people can go, maybe not to get their answers or get answers from, say, an insurance expert, but connect with somebody in person, ask some questions, get some information, and make sure that they get a referral to somebody who can help them out. So it's a bit of a transition from the Resiliency Center to Recovery Operations Center, or how you support people going forward. But I think at least initially for those first couple of weeks, giving people a place to go is really important.
Well, thank you for that. And we are literally 1 minute from the hour. I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for really kicking this thing off in high style. I think it was just awesome. I'm really going to encourage that we just stay in touch, continue to relate to each other, reach out to Chris and Deb. Their contact information is there. And I also want to let you know that we have another one of these coming on Groundhog Day, and it won't be a repeat of this one. It'll actually be a whole new one. If you've got a Bill Murray thing going on, the next webinar will be looking at donations management. It will be on February 2nd between noon and 1 p.m. Pacific. And because it's me, I'll leave you with an old Japanese proverb: fall 7 times and stand up 8, which seems something appropriate for where you're all at in British Columbia right now. But thank you so much. And thank you for all the people that have shared information. Like I say, the chat will be available. The recording will be available. Deb, we got to figure out how to get you back to really to go through that slide deck, especially the back end. The timeline thing is just so important. And I think we did your short shrift on that. So that's on us, and we'll get that figured out as we go forward. But thank you all. Hope to see you all. Share all of this information with not only your networks, but folks outside of your networks. We got to get more people involved in recovery. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Peter. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
I don't know if Deb's going to hang in here.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, if she wants to chat about anything, I'm happy to stay
Yeah,
on
maybe
for a
just-
couple minutes. So
Just a couple of minutes, just to do a bit of a debrief. It's always good.
Sure.
just to do that. But yeah, time just really got, got away. But I thought there was awesome material there.
Okay.
I
When we
agree.
started the recording. Stop the recording now. I don't know who
Okay.
it was.
Yeah, having another opportunity for Deb to dive into some of that with a bit more depth would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I could, and she's got so much to say there, and it's also a beautiful topic. So I wonder if we're looking at the next 5, if we can figure out, and I know they're like, we're down to it, but I wonder if we can figure that out. Now, I wonder, did she buzz off? I don't know if she's still with us. So we can stop the recording. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see her on anymore. So
Okay. Okay, well, I guess we can sign off, Chris, but thanks again for just a terrific presentation.
yeah, no worries. Thank you very much for hosting, Peter, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, exactly.
Take care.
Bye-bye.